Wow, well, it's such a pleasure to be with you this morning, and such an honor to follow Sam Assefa. We've had a chance to work with the California Jobs First team in OPR last year and a half or so, and they're just doing amazing work, so I really appreciate that. And it's such a joy, really, to partner with MBEP, and Tara in particular, on producing this report. One thing I want to acknowledge, if my posture up here seems a little bit awkward, I actually threw my back out earlier this week, and I wasn't sure I was going to even be able to get out of bed, much less join you this morning. But it's better now. I'm feeling glad to be here. I did mention to my father, who's a retired doctor, about the back pain, and he said, well, at least it's all behind you now, which is good. All right, I want to try an experiment. I'm going to say a phrase, and I want to see what kind of image comes into your mind when I say this phrase. You can close your eyes if you'd like, but you don't have to. So, y'all ready? Here's the phrase. Another academic report on the economy. Okay, how many people had an image that somehow had like dust, cobwebs, reports sitting on a shelf? Yeah, I see some nodding. How many people had an image of taking naps or good go-to-sleep bedtime reading? Yeah. That's a little bit of what we're up against in putting this report together. We actually want this to be the opposite of that. We want it to be a dialogue. It's built from, as Tara said, some of what we heard back from you last year when we presented our work on solidarity economics. And we hope this is a step towards all of us coming together to help build the inclusive economy in this region that we want. I have another challenge in trying to do that, though, is that, you know, I'm a nerd. I speak Nerdish. What that means is that when I'm at cocktail parties, I have nothing more enjoyable than to get into conversations with my colleagues about z-scores and multinomial logit regression equations. No, seriously. But that's probably why I don't get invited to very many cocktail parties these days. But I want to put another image in your mind of a nerd. This is when the nerd first came into print in this country, Dr. Seuss. It's a book called If I Ran the Zoo. And there's a Nurgle, a nerd, and a sea sucker too, who all come from the land of Katru. And I mention that because data should be about building a story and telling a story of our region. And there's going to be lots of numbers coming up, just getting you prepared for that. But hopefully it can be a way that you can help see yourselves in the data and see your goals and aspirations moving forward. Now, we're titling this report, you know, towards an inclusive economy in the region, because I think we all realize that promoting inclusive economies is an important goal. And some of the data we presented last year in the research is that inclusive economies are better economically, not just socially and democratically. Some of you may have read our previous book, Equity, Growth, and Community, which is also free to download on the web if you like. That's our solidarity with our readers. But that was looking at cases around the country, metropolitan regions, that were successful in linking growth and equity. And one of the things that seemed to be a constant across all of them is what we called a diverse epistemic community. That's one of those cocktail party conversations. It basically means that you have shared knowledge in a region across diverse constituencies, diverse perspectives, diverse geographies. And that becomes a common basis for prioritizing, strategizing, and moving our projects forward. So what this report is intended to do is not so much look at the month-to-month, day-to-day, what's happening with our economy, but to try and look at the broader stream that we're swimming in. And what are the currents that we need to be aware of? What are the areas that we need to pay attention to in that move towards an inclusive economy? And in putting together this set of statistics or indicators in the report. And of course, we could drown you all in data if you'd like. But we're trying to pick sort of a small number of indicators that can point to inclusivity in 5 different dimensions. Because we want to be looking at not just income inequality. Our economy should be able to provide for people on multiple dimensions of material well-being and growing in the right way. And so we built on this framework originally proposed by the Rockefeller Foundation that I and some colleagues were involved in helping to apply actually all over the world, in India, South Africa, Colombia, and other places, as well as metropolitan regions in the US, which really prioritizes understanding inclusivity in these 5 dimensions. An economy should be equitable, should be participatory, and I'll say a little bit more about what that looks like, should be growing if we are measuring growth in the right way. So it's not just GDP, as important as that is, but the distribution of economic output and the ability to grow in a way that's leading to more and better jobs overall. Of course, we need it to be sustainable and thinking about long-term decisions as well as preserving and regenerating our economy, our environment, and also stable. Because of course, one of the difficult things is when you can't plan to save for college or save for retirement or go through the experiences of unemployment. But we need to start with understanding who we are. You heard we're a very diverse region, has become more diverse over time. Monterey County has a bit over half of the total population of our 3-county region that we're looking at. But 62% of the population in the region are people of color. The population's been pretty steady over the last decade. It's declined just a little bit in the last 5 years, but we're pretty steady state on that. But what is shifting pretty dramatically is that racial composition over time. And one of the ways we like to look at this is what's called the racial generation gap, which compares the proportion of people 65 and older who are non-Hispanic white compared to the population 18 and younger who are non-Hispanic white or in reverse people of color. And part of what you can see is that there's a 43% gap when you look at that racial distribution. Now, why is that important? On the right are those who are more active in civic leadership, tend to vote more frequently, tend to be higher educated. To the left is our future. That's our future workforce, that's our future economy. That's where we need to be paying attention. And when that gap is large, it's a lot harder for those in leadership positions to see themselves in the future. And so that's one of the major gaps. We're one of the highest percentage of racial generation gap in the country, 3rd highest last I looked. The other places that tend to be high are mostly other retirement communities in Arizona, Florida, et cetera. And I mentioned it tends to be related to underinvestment in education. And as we start to get into other indicators now, this first dimension of equitable is we want to be paying attention, of course, to income distribution at the moment, but also upward mobility over time, the ability of children to have a better economic future than their parents. And education, we know, is one of the most critically important parts of that. This is a little bit of a complicated chart. It shows the percentage of the population, adult population, with less than a high school degree. This is a really important indicator because getting a high school degree is a first step to good positions in the labor market. You can also look at bachelor's degree or associate's degree, and actually some college degree or technical certification is really critical for access to good jobs. But at least getting that high school degree. And part of what you can see in this as we look at both male and female across multiple different racial groups as that's changed from 2010 to 2021 is that there's improvement across the board. That's the good news. The bad news is the incredible racial disparities that still exist, and that we have over 40% of our Latino population, adult population in the region, that don't have a high school degree. And that requires very significant investments in adult education, as well as really paying attention to our K-12 school system. Here's a measure of income inequality, sort of looking at the ratio of the top 20% of income earners over the bottom 20% of income earners. And in California, that ratio is now almost 18 to 1. It's a huge inequality, and it's gotten worse over the last decade. In our region, it's somewhat less. It's only about 10, 11 to 1. And it's actually been pretty flat and actually gotten a little better in the last period. So, again, mixed news. The bad news is we've got pretty high inequality, surprise, surprise. The good news is that it's not getting worse, and we're doing a little bit to make it better, at least when measured by income. But we also want to be looking at wealth and asset accumulation. And owning a home is really the only way the majority of working Americans can accumulate wealth over time and be able to pass it on intergenerationally. So looking at home ownership is a really critical indicator. And there, again, we can see these dramatic racial inequalities between Asian Pacific Islander population and non-Hispanic white population, with home ownership rates above 60% in our region, and all other racial groups barely above 40%. And pretty level, but tending down a little bit. So we know some of the housing challenges in the region. So moving to participatory, one of the participatory indicators is really trying to get at the fact that decision-making in the region should involve everyone in some ways about our economic investments, and then be transparent and accountable for those in leadership positions. And one way is looking at voting rates. And again, this is a complicated chart that is trying to show different proportion of the adult population who actually vote. This is a little different than voter turnout, which is typically measured over the percent who registered. Because we actually want to think about it in the context of the whole adult population, including not just those that are citizen voting age population, eligible voters, but what about the undocumented residents of our communities that are so important to our economic well-being and economic future? And to what extent are those who are voting able to represent them or not? Part of what we see is that Santa Cruz County has consistently the highest voter turnout over these elections. On the right are presidential elections, where they tend to be higher. On the left are the midterm elections, where rates seem to be lower. One of the good signs, again, is that we seem to be getting more and more turnout over the last decade or so. And it's a bit ironic that as our country has become more polarized, people have gotten more engaged in the electoral process, right? And that is both a challenge and an opportunity, right? The challenge, of course, we know of the divisions that sometimes face us, but the opportunity is people are engaged. So how do we have meaningful conversations that can overcome those differences and help get more people involved in civic life? One of the other challenges of this, again, looking at some of the racial disparities, is the different turnouts between, on the left, you'll see for all non-Latino population, and the greener the chart, the more turnout. On the right is our Latino population, and this is just of registered voters. So again, we have huge disparities in the level of voter turnout by Latino and non-Latino populations in our region. This is just Monterey County, but it's similar figures for Santa Cruz as well. So in participation, we also want to recognize that people can participate in the economy, in our economy, in multiple different ways, as workers, as business owners and entrepreneurs, and as consumers. And we have indicators of change over time in all three of those categories. This is one about participation as workers. And part of what we see is, pretty level labor force participation over time. When there's not, people aren't in the labor force, right? What are they doing? Some of them may be retired. Some of them may be, caring for the home and someone else is bringing income into the household. Some of them may be discouraged workers, would like to work, don't show up as unemployed, and don't show as active in the labor market. And so part of what we need to do, and part of the conversation, is how do we explain these disparate labor force participation rates and the particularly low labor force participation rates of African Americans in our region? What are the structural barriers that are preventing African Americans from being as active in the labor market? One of the factors is that a significant portion of the African American population in our community is incarcerated in Soledad. And those statistics show up in this way. And so dealing with our mass incarceration system and trying to lead towards repair and reconciliation rather than punishment in our whole system, I think is really important. I also want to lift up, we have some data in here about our undocumented residents in the region and their labor force participation, which is perhaps unsurprisingly much higher than the documented population because they have fewer alternatives, often ineligible for many public support programs, particularly federal ones. The state has been a real leader in trying to make social support available for undocumented residents as well. Business participation, some indicators about how are we doing in small business development and ownership over time. And there's actually been an uptick in a long-term increase in many parts of our region in new business applications. Right? That's encouraging because we know from some national statistics, by the way, that new business creation and entrepreneurial activity has declined over the last 30 to 40 years. And many people point to increasing monopolies and oligopolies in key economic sectors as one of the reasons that constrains that. The other major constraint is having a workplace-based healthcare system or health insurance system because it provides a disincentive to take the risk of starting a new business if you might lose your health. So again, this is a way of pointing to some of the interconnectivities and mutuality, interdependence in our economy that we need to be paying attention to. But once again, there are pretty dramatic racial disparities in these indicators. This is an indicator of the proportion of population by race that has any self-employment income. And non-Hispanic white is the highest. There's been an increase in the Asian population in our region, which is really interesting. I'd love to understand more what are the kinds of businesses that are being created in our communities by Asian and Pacific Islanders. Something to think about, something to work more on. Okay, the growing sector. Again, we're trying to look at not just GDP growth, but really trying to understand how are we increasing the good jobs in our region, and not just the number of good jobs, but how are we turning bad jobs into good jobs? So on the basic area of real, like inflation-adjusted economic output, generally we've been improving over time, although substantially below the California average. And that has to do with the mix of industries in our region, agriculture, tourism, accommodation, one of the challenges we face of trying to build those good jobs. Now, this is another way of visualizing jobs in our economy, and it's a little complicated. The bubble is the size of employment. So agriculture is the largest bubble. This is Monterey County, but similar figures for Santa Cruz. And you can see the other large industries in the region: healthcare, social assistance, accommodation, and food services. On the horizontal axis is the average annual growth rate in jobs over the last 5 years. And on the vertical axis is the average wage in that job. So test for everyone, which quadrant do we want to be in? Upper right, right? Good growing jobs that are high wage and big bubbles, right? But what we've got, unfortunately, is a large employment sector that has seen decline in employment over this 5-year period and relatively low wages. I think that's one of the major challenges we have in the region is how do we improve the economic opportunity in our agricultural sector? And I'm one who thinks there actually are many opportunities in ag tech, in technology, if we do it right and in partnership with workers in the field and have systems in place to help with some of the displacement that's undoubtedly going to happen as we're improving productivity in our agricultural enterprises, which I think is really important. One of the pieces of good news is here that x-axis, horizontal axis, is the change in pay over this time period. And one of the things we see is in a couple of those low-wage sectors, accommodation and food services and retail trade, actually there's been pretty substantial wage growth over the last 5 years. That primarily happened because of the very tight labor markets that occurred coming out of the pandemic, and the fact that employers were having to offer wages to get anyone to come in, at a higher level. But that dynamic did not seem to have an impact in the fields. And so that's, again, a challenge we need to be addressing. And of course, part of what we're trying to look at in these growing is our economy able to provide for material well-being, not just the wages? And so we look at poverty levels. One of the better measures of that is to actually look at 200% of the federal poverty level. It's a little more realistic assessment of poverty or economic hardship given the cost of living in the region. And that has come down. Part of that is due to the tremendous supports that came from the federal government during the pandemic were really important. So we'll want to track this over time to see how that looks. And again, looking, of course, housing is a huge problem, looking at the extent to which people are overpaying for housing in the region. 30% is considered an affordable amount of an income on housing. We have 25% of households in our region are spending more than 30%, more than 50% of their income on housing. And 55% are spending more than 30%. That's an unaffordable level. And one of the greatest measures of, I think, material well-being that incorporates so many different dimensions of income and health and opportunity, stress or lack thereof, is life expectancy. And you all have probably seen statistics about, the zip code that you're born in largely shapes your life opportunities. And that shows up really dramatically when you look at life expectancy at birth by zip code, where there's as much as a 16-year difference between certain neighborhoods in our region and others. So again, that's something that we need to really be paying attention to going forward. Here's some good news, sustainable, and really trying to think about our environmental well-being and long-term decision-making. One interesting measure is looking at the amount of economic output per unit of energy. This is showing electricity. We have another chart on natural gas use in our county. Both of them are showing declining trends. So we're getting more energy efficient in our economy. And this includes both residential and non-residential. We're improving greenhouse gas emissions. We're reducing air pollution. Almost universally good news in that sustainable category. So that's great. Stable is something that very few economists look at, actually. It's kind of a blank slate in some of the research of how stability in an economy shapes people's experience. But we know from so much anecdotal evidence and some research that if you can avoid the ups and downs of economic recession, then you'll see sustained growth, sustained well-being over time. And the reverse, if you get unemployed, it has lasting impacts for a long time. So we're trying to better understand that in our region. This shows you the percent change in economic output of each of our counties compared to California. Standard deviation is a standard way of measuring that volatility, and our volatility is higher in the region than state. It's probably not surprising. It's a smaller and more concentrated economy, but we want to be thinking about not just for people's well-being, but our local governments as well, and the ability to have long-term planning and stable budgets in our city and county government depends on a stable economy. And the other part of that is, both looking at availability of social welfare support or safety net supports, but also when we look at some of the consumer data, the ability of people to invest in savings for higher education for their kids, savings for retirement. And we do have some indicators about levels of inequality of that in the region. So this is the slide that's got a lot of text that tries to summarize kind of what we're finding in this data, which, in most places is a mix of some things we can be proud of and some challenges that we need to be facing. So, income inequality is high but relatively stable. We're seeing improvements in educational outcomes, but still stark racial inequalities. Our participation in civic life, at least as measured by voting, is low, and real racial disparities in labor force participation, business involvement. What I pointed to of the need to really address improving jobs, particularly in agriculture, but also in our tourism industry, accommodation and food service. How do we make those good jobs as we're trying to grow good jobs in other sectors? And this question about a regional economy being still volatile. And in my last 26 seconds, I want to say, what's coming next? And the thing I want to emphasize is data is only part of the story. You really need a full DNA, data, stories, narrative, the more in-depth textual understanding of these processes in our region. And then how does that connect with action around real policies and practices and changes that we're making? And so this is the invitation to be in dialogue with you about how does your work relate to what we're seeing and what can we be learning from your doing in a way that can help improve this work going forward. This report and PowerPoint will be up on both the MBEP and Institute for Social Transformation site by the end of the month, hopefully. And then we intend to engage in a targeted set of deeper dives, ongoing listening sessions and discussions with you as we move through the year and perhaps come back and visit these statistics a year from now. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you during the day.